Picture this. A body lies wrapped in blankets on a bed, beard grown long from weeks of survival. Around him, canned food sits untouched. A propane tank, fully functional, never turned on. Matches scattered on the floor, never lit. This man had everything he needed to live. Instead, he chose to slowly starve to death in the freezing cold. But here's what makes it even more disturbing. He wasn't alone when he got there. 4 friends had made this impossible journey with him through 20 miles of snow-covered wilderness. Their car was found abandoned, engine running perfectly, gas in the tank. So what made 5 grown men abandon safety and march into a frozen nightmare? What happened to the Yuba County 5? If you've never heard of the Yuba County 5, you're not alone. This case has been overshadowed by more famous mysteries, but I'm telling you right now, this one will keep you awake at night. Some people call it America's Dyatlov Pass incident, and once you hear the full story, you'll understand why. February 24th, 1978, a cold Friday night in Northern California. 5 friends decide to drive 50 miles to watch a college basketball game. It should have been simple. Drive there, watch the game, maybe grab some snacks, drive home. End of story. Instead, it became one of the most baffling disappearances in American history. These weren't reckless teenagers looking for trouble. These were grown men in their 20s and 30s. Men with developmental disabilities who valued routine and safety above everything else. Men who had never shown any interest in camping, hiking, or wilderness adventures. Hell, one of them was terrified of the cold. Yet somehow, someway, they ended up 70 miles off course in one of the most remote areas of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Their car, a pristine 1969 Mercury Montego, was found abandoned on a dirt logging road that led absolutely nowhere. No mechanical problems, no flat tires, a quarter tank of gas still in it. But the 5 men? Gone. Vanished into the frozen wilderness without a trace. Now I know what you're thinking. People get lost all the time, right? Take a wrong turn, panic, make bad decisions. But this case breaks every rule of logic you can think of. Because when searchers finally found some of their bodies months later, the discoveries raised more questions than answers. We're talking about evidence that contradicts itself at every turn, clues that make absolutely no sense when you put them together. You've got a man who survived for weeks in a trailer stocked with supplies, but never used any of them. You've got footprints leading away from a perfectly good car into a winter wasteland. You've got one man who simply vanished completely, leaving behind only his shoes. And here's the thing that really gets to me. We're not just talking about some random tragedy. These 5 guys were friends, real friends, the kind who looked out for each other, who stuck together through everything. They had families who loved them, dreams they were chasing, a basketball tournament they were excited about the very next day. So what happened that night? What could possibly make 5 men abandon everything safe and familiar and walk 20 miles through snow-covered mountains in the middle of winter? Over the next 30 minutes, we're going to dig deep into this mystery. We'll meet each of these 5 men and understand why their disappearance was so completely out of character. We'll follow the timeline of that fateful night, step by step. We'll examine every piece of evidence, every theory, every possible explanation. And I'll warn you right now, by the end of this video, you're going to have more questions than when we started. Because the Yuba County 5 case isn't just unsolved, it's unsolvable. Every answer leads to 3 more questions. Every piece of evidence contradicts the last. But that's exactly why we need to tell their story. Because Gary Mathias, Ted Weiher, Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, and Jack Huett deserve to be remembered for more than just the mystery of their deaths. They deserve to be remembered as the friends they were, and the lives they lived. So buckle up, because we're about to dive into one of the strangest, most heartbreaking cases in true crime history. And trust me, you've never heard anything quite like this before. Before we dive into what happened that night, you need to understand who these 5 men really were. Because once you get to know them, you'll realize just how impossible their story becomes. Let's start with Gary Mathias, 25 years old, and in many ways the most complex of the group. Gary had served in the army and been stationed in Germany, but his military career ended when he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Now, before you jump to conclusions, Gary had been managing his condition really well. He'd been on medication for nearly 5 years, held down a steady job with his stepfather's landscaping business, and was excited about rebuilding his life. Gary was the only one in the group who sometimes stayed out late or hung around with older friends. But even then, he always let people know where he was going. The night of February 24th, he promised his mother he'd be home right after the game. No coat needed, he said, just a quick trip. Then there's Ted Weiher, 32 years old and the oldest of the group. But Ted had the mind of a child. He was one of those people who just radiated kindness, always volunteering, always helping out, always had a smile for everyone he met. Ted worked at a snack bar until his family convinced him to quit because they worried the pressure was too much for him. Ted was deeply religious and spent a lot of his free time with Bill Sterling, reading Bible verses and talking about faith. The two of them had this innocent friendship that was just pure, you know? Ted was also terrified of being cold. I mean, really terrified. His family said he'd bundle up in multiple layers, even on mildly cool days. Bill Sterling was 29 and the heart of the entire group. Bill had a developmental disability and lived with his parents, but don't mistake that for helplessness. This guy had more compassion in his little finger than most people have in their entire bodies. He spent hours at the local hospital reading Bible verses to patients. He loved going to the library, loved his church, loved his friends. Bill's family described him as having this gentle, childlike wonder about the world. He got excited about simple things, a good basketball game, a new book, spending time with his buddies. The night they disappeared, Bill had told his grandmother he wouldn't need his coat. Just like Gary, he was planning to be home early. Jack Huett was the baby of the group at 24. Jack had a learning disability, but what he lacked in academic smarts, he made up for in pure joy. This kid, and I say kid because that's how his family remembered him, had this infectious enthusiasm about everything. He loved nature, loved sports, loved laughing with his friends. Jack was described as having a childlike innocence that was just beautiful to be around. He lived under the loving care of his family, and they were incredibly protective of him. Jack wasn't the type to wander off or take risks. He was a homebody who felt safest when he was with the people he trusted most. And finally, there's Jack Madruga, 30 years old and the driver of the group. Now, Jack had never been officially diagnosed with an intellectual disability, but he functioned at a lower level and needed structure in his daily life. What made Jack special was his fierce independence and his absolute devotion to his friends. Jack had served in the army in Vietnam before being discharged after a medical evaluation. When he came home, he worked hard to buy his pride and joy, that beautiful turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego. Jack loved that car more than almost anything. He was meticulous about taking care of it, cautious about where he drove it, and protective of it like it was his child. Here's the key thing about Jack. He hated the cold and had zero interest in wilderness adventures. His idea of a perfect evening was watching basketball with his friends, maybe going to a movie, then driving everyone safely home in his beloved Montego. Together, these 5 men formed something really special. They weren't just friends, they were brothers. They met through the Gateway program, a vocational rehabilitation center in Yuba City, and they'd formed this tight-knit group that supported each other in everything. They even played basketball together as a team called the Gateway Gators. And here's what makes February 24th even more tragic. They had a tournament the very next day. A Special Olympics tournament they'd been training for and dreaming about for weeks. Ted had already laid out his uniform. Bill had been talking excitedly about it for days. They were convinced they had a real shot at winning. If they won their regional tournament, they'd get a free trek to Los Angeles for the state championship. Can you imagine how excited they were? These guys lived for basketball, lived for competition, lived for the chance to prove themselves. So when I tell you that these 5 men abandoned a perfectly good car to walk into a frozen wilderness, I want you to remember who they really were. Careful men, cautious men, men who valued safety and routine above adventure. Men who were excited about tomorrow, not running from today. Keep that in mind as we dive into what happened next, because knowing who they were makes their story so much more impossible to believe. February 24th, 1978, started like any other Friday for the 5 friends. There was excitement in the air, but it was the good kind, the kind that comes with looking forward to something fun. Ted Weiher had spent the morning carefully laying out his Gateway Gators basketball uniform for the next day's tournament. He folded it just so, making sure every crease was perfect. This was his big day coming up, and he wanted everything to be ready. Mathias sat at his kitchen table that evening, eating dinner with his mother and stepfather. Between bites of meatloaf, he kept glancing out the window, watching for his friends to arrive. Despite the weather forecast calling for light snow that night, Gary assured his mother he wouldn't need his windbreaker. "I'll be home right after the game," he promised. "Won't be out long." A few miles away, Ted Weiher was rushing through his own dinner, eating so fast his grandmother Imogene had to tell him to slow down. When he heard the honk of a car horn outside, Ted jumped up immediately. Just like Gary, he insisted he wouldn't need a coat. It was just going to be a quick trip to watch some basketball and then straight home. Outside in the driveway sat Jack Madruga behind the wheel of his treasured 1969 Mercury Montego. That car was Jack's pride and joy, turquoise and white, always kept in perfect condition. Jack took better care of that Montego than some people take care of their children. In the passenger seat was Jack Huett, probably bouncing with excitement like he always did when the group got together. And in the back sat Bill Sterling, quiet and gentle as always, but you could tell he was looking forward to the evening ahead. The plan was simple and straightforward. The kind of plan these guys made all the time. Drive from Yuba City to Oroville to pick up Gary, then head up to Chico State University to watch the college basketball game. Maybe grab some snacks afterward. Then home to get a good night's sleep before their own tournament the next day. It was about a 50-mile drive to Chico, nothing unusual for them. They'd made similar trips before. Jack was a careful driver, and his friends trusted him completely. The Montego was reliable, well-maintained, and perfect for a simple evening out. The basketball game at Chico State went exactly as planned. Several witnesses later confirmed seeing all 5 men at the game. They seemed happy, normal, enjoying themselves. Nothing out of the ordinary. No arguments, no signs of distress, no indication that anything was wrong. After the game ended around 10 o'clock, the 5 friends did exactly what you'd expect them to do. They stopped at Bears Market, a local convenience store near the campus. The store clerk remembered them clearly. 5 men buying snacks for the road home. They purchased Hostess pies, chocolate milk, soda, and candy bars. Classic road trip food. The clerk said they seemed cheerful and normal, chatting among themselves as they made their selections. Gary paid for the snacks, and they headed back out to the Montego. This was around 10:30 at night. Light snow was beginning to fall, just as the weather forecast had predicted. But it wasn't anything serious, just a gentle dusting that shouldn't have caused any problems for experienced drivers like Jack. The store clerk watched them leave the parking lot, the Montego's headlights disappearing into the night as they headed toward what should have been a straight shot home to Yuba City. At this point, everything was still perfectly normal. 5 friends had enjoyed a basketball game, bought some snacks, and were heading home with plenty of time to get a good night's sleep before their big tournament. Their families were expecting them. Their uniforms were laid out and ready. Their dreams of winning and maybe earning that trip to Los Angeles were just hours away from potentially coming true. Nobody, not their families, not the police, not the friends themselves, had any idea that this simple, ordinary evening was about to become one of the most baffling mysteries in American history. Because somewhere between that convenience store in Chico and their homes in Yuba City, something went terribly, impossibly wrong. And to this day, nobody knows what that something was. When the 5 friends didn't come home that night, their families knew immediately that something was wrong. See, this wasn't like dealing with typical young adults who might decide to stay out late or crash at a friend's place. These were men who valued routine, who kept their promises, who always let people know where they were going. Gary had promised his mother he'd be home right after the game. Ted had told his grandmother the same thing. None of them were the type to just disappear. By Saturday morning, February 25th, panic was setting in. This was supposed to be the day of their big basketball tournament, the day they'd been training for, dreaming about, preparing for. Their uniforms were laid out and ready. Their teammates were expecting them. Their families were planning to come cheer them on. But the Gateway Gators were nowhere to be found. The families started calling each other frantically. "Have you heard from Ted? Did Gary come home? Where's Jack?" But nobody had any answers. None of the 5 men had been seen or heard from since they'd left for the basketball game the night before. That's when they called the police. Now, typically, adults have to be missing for 24 to 48 hours before police will take a report seriously. But these weren't typical circumstances. When the officers heard about 5 men with developmental disabilities who had failed to return home, who had missed their own tournament, who had broken every routine they'd ever established, they knew this was serious. Lieutenant Lance Ayers of the Yuba County Police took charge of the case immediately. And here's something that made it personal for him. He actually knew the boys. He'd gone to high school with Ted Weiher's brothers. These weren't just names on a missing persons report. These were real people he cared about. Ayers organized search teams right away. They started by retracing the route the boys should have taken from Chico back to Yuba City. It's a straightforward drive. You take Highway 70 south for about 50 miles. Simple, direct, a route that Jack Madruga had driven before. But something had gone wrong along the way. The breakthrough came on February 28th, 4 days after the disappearance. A forest ranger was doing routine patrol work in the Plumas National Forest when he spotted something that didn't belong. A car sitting alone on a remote logging road. It was Jack's Mercury Montego. But here's where this case takes its first turn into the impossible. The Montego was found 70 miles northeast of Chico, 70 miles in the complete opposite direction from where they should have been going. They were supposed to be heading south to Yuba City. Instead, the car was found way up in the Sierra Nevada mountains on a dirt logging road that led absolutely nowhere. When the authorities examined the scene, what they found defied all logic. The car was in perfect condition. The engine turned over immediately when they tested it. There were no flat tires, no mechanical problems, nothing wrong with the vehicle at all. There was still a quarter tank of gas, more than enough to get them home. The doors were unlocked, and one window was rolled down slightly. Inside, investigators found the snacks they'd bought at Bear's Market, some still uneaten. There were also 4 maps folded neatly in the glove compartment, but the keys were missing. Most importantly, the car wasn't stuck. It hadn't slid off the road or gotten trapped in snow. It was parked properly, as if someone had simply decided to stop there and get out. But why? Why would 5 men who hated the cold, who had no experience with wilderness camping, who were excited about their tournament the next day, abandon a perfectly good car on a freezing mountain road in the middle of the night? Search teams immediately expanded their efforts to the surrounding area. They found some footprints in the snow leading away from the car and heading deeper into the forest. The tracks appeared to match the shoe sizes of the 5 men, but they quickly disappeared under fresh snowfall. The search was massive. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights scanning the endless wilderness. Search dogs were brought in to try to pick up a scent. Dozens of volunteers trudged through snowdrifts and thick forest brush, calling out the boys' names until their voices went hoarse. But it was like the 5 men had simply vanished into thin air. For months, Lieutenant Ayres and the search teams pushed through brutal weather and treacherous terrain. They followed every lead, chased down every tip, searched every possible hiding spot within miles of that abandoned car. Nothing. No bodies, no clothing, no supplies, no trace of the 5 friends anywhere. As winter turned to spring, hope began to fade. Where were Gary, Ted, Jack, Bill, and Jack? What had happened to them after they left that car? And most haunting of all, were they still alive somewhere out there in the wilderness? June 4th, 1978. 4 months after the 5 friends had vanished, a group of motorcyclists were exploring the remote wilderness of Plumas National Forest, enjoying the warm weather and scenic mountain trails. They pulled off the main trail to rest and noticed something unusual: a cluster of buildings tucked away in a secluded area. It was a U.S. Forest Service station, the kind they use for fire spotting and emergency operations in remote areas. Most of the time, places like this sit empty, only used when needed. As the motorcyclists got closer, they noticed something wrong. A sickly sweet smell hung in the air. The kind of smell that makes your stomach turn and tells you immediately that something has died nearby. One of the riders noticed that a window in the main trailer had been broken. After some discussion, they decided to investigate. The door was unlocked, so they went inside. Nothing could have prepared them for what they found. On a bed at the rear of the trailer, wrapped carefully in 8 heavy winter blankets, lay the body of Ted Weiher. But the scene inside that trailer was so much more disturbing than just finding a body. Because Ted hadn't just died. He had survived in that trailer for weeks, maybe months, slowly wasting away while surrounded by everything he needed to live. When investigators arrived and examined Ted's body, they found he had lost nearly half his body weight. His 200-pound frame had withered down to barely 120 pounds. The length of his beard suggested he had been alive for 8 to 13 weeks after the night he disappeared. 8 to 13 weeks of slowly starving to death. His feet were blackened with severe frostbite. His shoes were nowhere to be found. It appeared he had taken them off early in his stay at the trailer and never put them back on, even as the cold ravaged his exposed feet. But here's what made investigators physically sick when they realized it. Ted didn't have to die. The trailer was stocked with supplies. There were sea rations scattered on the floor, military meals that Ted had apparently eaten at some point. But in a locked cabinet in the same room, there were cases of dehydrated food, easily prepared meals, enough food to feed several people for an entire year. The cabinet wasn't actually locked. Investigators opened it easily. Ted could have accessed this food at any time. There was a propane tank outside the trailer, in perfect working condition. It would have provided heat and cooking fuel for weeks. But the valve had never been turned on. There were boxes of matches scattered around the trailer. There were paperback books and magazines that could have been used as kindling. But no fire had ever been lit. Ted Weiher had died of exposure and starvation, while surrounded by heat, food, and everything he needed to survive. Why? The discoveries got worse. Just 11 miles from the trailer, search teams found the remains of Jack Madruga. His body had been there for months, exposed to the elements and wild animals. Most of the flesh was gone from his right arm. His eyes were missing. 2 fingers had been chewed off, but he was still clutching his favorite watch in his remaining hand. It appeared Jack had died while trying to make his way back toward the car, following the road that led down the mountain. But he hadn't made it far. In a heavily wooded area on the other side of the road, investigators found scattered bones and clothing. The remains belonged to Bill Sterling. His body had been completely consumed by forest animals. His bones spread over an area of 50 square feet. Articles of clothing confirmed his identity, the same clothes his family remembered him wearing that last night. 2 days later, Jack Huett's father joined the search, despite police pleas for him to stay home. Tragically, he was the one who found his son's backbone and the Levi's jeans Jack had been wearing. The following day, an assistant sheriff found Jack's skull. Dental records confirmed what everyone already knew. Jack Huett was dead too. But there was still one missing piece to this horrific puzzle. Gary Mathias was nowhere to be found. However, inside the trailer where Ted had died, investigators made a chilling discovery. Gary's shoes. His shoes were there, but Gary wasn't. This suggested that Gary had been at the trailer with Ted, at least for some time. Had he swapped shoes with Ted because of the frostbite? Had he tried to help his friend? A quarter of a mile northwest of the trailer, searchers found 3 blankets and a flashlight. The theory was that maybe Gary had taken these supplies and gone looking for the others. Maybe he had tried to bring them warmth. But somewhere out there in the wilderness, Gary had gotten lost and succumbed to the elements himself. Or maybe something else had happened to Gary, something we'll never know. To this day, Gary Mathias's body has never been found. So let's step back and look at what we know happened. 5 men somehow made their way from an abandoned car 20 miles through treacherous, snow-covered wilderness to reach this remote trailer. Ted made it inside and survived for months, but never used the available food or heat. The other 3 died somewhere along the journey, their bodies scattered across the mountainside. And Gary? Gary simply vanished completely. But the discoveries raised more questions than they answered. If they were all together when they reached the trailer, why did 3 of them leave? Were they going for help? Were they trying to find a way back to the car? And Ted, why didn't he save himself? He had food, he had heat, he had shelter. Yet he chose to slowly waste away wrapped in blankets, watching himself die. What had happened to these 5 friends out there in the wilderness? What had driven them to abandon their car and walk 20 miles through freezing mountains? And what had kept Ted from using the supplies that could have saved his life? The answers, if they exist at all, died with them in those mountains. So what the hell happened to the Yuba County 5? How do you explain 5 men abandoning a perfectly good car to walk 20 miles through a frozen wilderness, only to die surrounded by supplies that could have saved them? For over 40 years, investigators, amateur sleuths, and the families themselves have tried to piece together a theory that makes sense. But here's the problem. Every explanation falls apart when you look at the evidence. Let's start with the official theory, because it's the most logical place to begin. Police concluded that the men had simply gotten lost. Maybe they took a wrong turn after leaving the convenience store in Chico. Maybe the light snowfall that night made visibility poor. Maybe they ended up on the mountain road by accident, realized they were lost, and in their panic and confusion, abandoned the car and tried to walk home. On the surface, this makes sense. People with developmental disabilities might not handle a crisis situation the same way others would. They might make decisions that seem irrational to us, but felt logical to them in the moment. But this theory starts crumbling the moment you look closer. First, the road where the car was found wasn't just a wrong turn. It was 70 miles in the complete opposite direction from where they should have been going. You don't accidentally drive 70 miles the wrong way and not realize it, especially when you're on familiar highways that Jack had driven before. Second, even if they had gotten lost, why not just turn around? The car was working fine. They had gas. They could have simply backed up and retraced their route. Why abandon the car and walk into a wilderness that none of them knew anything about? And third, this theory doesn't explain Ted's behavior in the trailer at all. Even if panic had driven them to make the initial mistake, Ted survived in that trailer for months. He had time to think, time to plan, time to use the supplies around him, but he didn't. So if the official theory doesn't work, what about foul play? This is where things get really dark. Some people believe the 5 men encountered someone dangerous that night. Maybe they witnessed something they shouldn't have seen. Maybe they were forced off the road by someone with malicious intent. There's actually some evidence that might support this theory. A man named Joseph Jones came forward and reported that on the night of February 24th, he had been driving along the same mountain road where the car was later found. His Volkswagen had gotten stuck in the snow, and he'd suffered a mild heart attack trying to get it unstuck. Jones said that around 2 a.m., he was awakened by strange whistling sounds. Looking out his window, he saw several men and a woman holding a baby, backlit by car headlights about 100 feet away. When he called out for help, the group quickly disappeared, and the lights vanished. Later that same night, Jones was awakened again by more lights and whistling sounds, but he couldn't see who was responsible. In the morning, as he walked back to get help, he noticed the Mercury Montego sitting on the road, but thought nothing of it at the time. Could this have been the 5 friends? And if so, who were the other people? Was this some kind of confrontation that ended badly? There were also rumors that shell casings had been found near the entrance to the mountain road, though this was never officially confirmed. If true, it might suggest that someone had fired shots at the car, forcing the men to flee into the wilderness. But the foul play theory has problems too. If someone was chasing them or threatening them, why stop at a convenience store to buy snacks? The clerk said they seemed normal and happy, not like people running for their lives. And if they were being pursued, wouldn't they have tried to use the trailer's radio to call for help? Then there's the Gary Mathias theory. Some people believe that Gary, who had a history of schizophrenia, might have had a psychotic break that night. Maybe his medication had stopped working. Maybe the stress of the situation triggered an episode. Maybe he convinced or forced his friends to drive up that mountain road. This theory would explain why they ended up so far off course. It might explain why they abandoned the car. Gary had military training. Maybe he thought he could lead them to safety through the wilderness. Maybe in his altered mental state, he believed they were in danger and needed to hide. But this theory falls apart when you consider the timeline. Gary's family said he had been stable for years. He was holding down a job, maintaining relationships, looking forward to the tournament. There were no signs of mental health issues leading up to that night. And if Gary had been having an episode, would his friends really have followed him into the wilderness? These were men who looked out for each other, who would have tried to get Gary help, not enable his delusions. Plus, Gary's shoes being found in the trailer suggests he was trying to help Ted, not harm him. That's not the behavior of someone in a psychotic state. Some people have suggested even more outlandish theories: alien abduction, Bigfoot encounters, secret government experiments. But these explanations are just desperate attempts to make sense of something that might not have a rational explanation. The truth is, every theory we've come up with has fatal flaws. The evidence contradicts itself at every turn. You can't build a coherent narrative that explains all the facts, because the facts don't want to fit together. Maybe that's the most terrifying thing about the Yuba County 5 case. Maybe there isn't a logical explanation. Maybe sometimes terrible things happen for no reason at all, and we're left to wonder what we could have done differently. What we do know is that 5 friends died in the wilderness when they didn't have to. And 45 years later, we're still no closer to understanding why. 45 years have passed since that cold February night in 1978. 45 years of unanswered questions, sleepless nights, and families who never got the closure they deserved. The case of the Yuba County 5 remains officially unsolved, despite decades of investigation, despite modern forensic techniques being applied to the evidence, despite countless amateur detectives trying to crack the code. We're no closer to understanding what really happened. Lieutenant Lance Ayers, the officer who led the original investigation, spent years obsessing over this case. He followed every lead, chased down every tip, interviewed every possible witness. It consumed him. Even in retirement, he continued searching for answers that never came. The families of the 5 men have carried this burden for decades. Some, like Ted Weiher's mother, made annual pilgrimages to that remote trailer, leaving flowers and hoping for some sign, some revelation that might finally explain why her son died surrounded by everything he needed to live. Others joined online communities dedicated to cold cases, posting age progression photos of Gary Mathias, wondering if somewhere out there he might still be alive. The hope never really dies, even when logic says it should. The case has left its mark on Yuba City too. Locals still whisper about it in coffee shops and diners. True crime enthusiasts make pilgrimages to the area, trying to retrace the route, trying to find some clue that everyone else missed. The story gets passed down from generation to generation, a local legend that refuses to fade. And maybe that's fitting, because the Yuba County 5 weren't just victims of some random tragedy. They were real people with real dreams. Gary Mathias, who was rebuilding his life and looking forward to the future. Ted Weiher, with his childlike kindness and volunteer spirit. Jack Madruga, proud of his car and devoted to his friends. Bill Sterling, reading Bible verses to hospital patients and spreading joy wherever he went. Jack Huett, young and enthusiastic and full of life. They deserved better than the fate they met in those mountains. They deserved to play in their tournament, to chase their dreams of winning that trip to Los Angeles, to grow old surrounded by the people who love them. But they also deserve to be remembered for more than just the mystery of their deaths. They deserve to be remembered as the friends they were, the lives they lived, the kindness they showed to the world. Their story reminds us that life can change in an instant, that sometimes there are no answers, no neat explanations, no closure. Sometimes terrible things happen to good people and we're left to wonder why. But it also reminds us of the importance of friendship, loyalty, and looking out for each other. Even in their final moments, scattered across that wilderness, these 5 men were still trying to take care of one another. Gary giving Ted his shoes, Ted wrapped carefully in blankets. The bonds of friendship lasting even unto death. The mountains of Northern California still hold their secrets. Maybe someday, someone will find Gary Mathias's remains and will have one more piece of the puzzle. Maybe someday, new evidence will surface that finally explains what happened that night. Or maybe the mystery will endure forever, a reminder that some questions don't have answers. But as long as we keep telling their story, Gary Mathias, Ted Weiher, Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, and Jack Huett will never be truly lost. They'll live on in our memory, 5 friends who faced the unknown together and remind us what really matters in life. Rest in peace, boys. You deserved so much better.